"You have two choices," Thomas Reed said, dropping the papers onto the table in front of her. "Sign this over to me today or watch the bank take it from you by Friday." Evelyn Carter looked at the deed. Her father's name was on it. A man who had loved this land in silence for 23 years, who had paid its taxes from 1,000 miles away, who had left it to her, with one sentence that mattered: "You find a way through." She slid the papers back across the table. "There's a third choice," she said quietly. "I stay, I fight, and I win." Reed stared at her. Nobody in Dawson Creek had ever said that to his face. Nobody had ever meant it either, until now. Welcome to our channel. Subscribe and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter came on a Tuesday. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, tucked between a telephone bill and a furniture catalog, as if it had no idea what it was about to do to her life. Evelyn Carter stood in the narrow hallway of her Boston apartment, still wearing her coat, her work bag still on her shoulder, and she opened it, the way she opened everything, efficiently, without ceremony, expecting nothing. She read it once, then she sat down on the floor. Her father was dead. Not her biological father, the man who had walked out when she was 4 years old, and whose face she could barely remember. No, the man the letter described was Harold Carter, the quiet accountant from Nebraska who had taken in a 7-year-old girl with a broken suitcase and a habit of flinching at loud noises, and who had spent the next 21 years making sure she never had a reason to flinch again. Harold, who made oatmeal on Sunday mornings and read the newspaper aloud at the kitchen table. Harold, who had driven 11 hours when she got her first job offer just so he could shake her hand and say he was proud of her. Harold was gone, and apparently Harold had a secret. He owned a ranch, not a small property, not a summer cabin. A full cattle ranch in Dawson Creek, Montana, 1,200 acres of land with a farmhouse, a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a herd of cattle that had apparently been shrinking for 3 years straight. The letter was from a lawyer named Gerald Oates, who informed her in 3 very careful paragraphs that the property had been in Harold's name since 1879, that it was currently operating at a significant loss, that there was outstanding debt against the property totaling more than its current assessed value, and that as Harold Carter's sole heir, all of it, the land, the cattle, the debt, and the disaster, now belonged to her. Evelyn sat on the floor of her hallway for a long time. She thought about calling someone, her friend Clara, maybe, or her supervisor at the commercial firm, where she worked as a secretary, transcribing letters and organizing files for men who never learned her last name. But what would she say? She had no words for this. She had no framework for what she was holding in her hands. She had been to Montana exactly once, when she was 19, on a train that passed through the state without stopping. She had looked out the window at the flat brown expanse and thought it looked like the end of the world. She had not thought about it again. 3 weeks later, she stepped off a wagon in Dawson Creek with 2 leather trunks, a letter of authorization, and absolutely no idea what she was doing. The town was smaller than she expected. 1 main street, a general store, a post office, a church that needed painting, a saloon that apparently did not. The people moved slowly and watched her immediately, the way people watch something that does not belong, not with hostility, exactly, but with the calm certainty of those who already know how the story ends. The lawyer Gerald Oates met her at the livery stable. He was a small man with large spectacles and the careful manner of someone who delivered bad news for a living, and had made a kind of peace with it. "Miss Carter," he said, shaking her hand, "I'm glad you came in person. These matters are always better handled in person." "Tell me about the ranch," she said. He told her. It was worse than the letter had made it sound. The debt was significant. The cattle herd had been reduced from nearly 200 head to 63. The farmhouse roof had been damaged in a storm 18 months ago and never properly repaired. The barn's east wall had partially collapsed. The fields had not been properly worked in 2 seasons. And the man Harold had employed To manage things in his absence, a ranch hand named Pete Sully had left in February withaut notice, taking 3 months of unpaid wages out of the livestock fund and 2 of the better horses. "How long before the bank forecloses?" Evelyn asked. Gerald looked at her over his spectacles. "Thomas Reed has been patient, given Harold's history with this town. But patience has a number attached to it, Miss Carter. I'd say you have perhaps 6 months before he moves formally. And if I sell now, Reed has made an offer. It's not generous. But it's real money." Evelyn folded her hands on the desk. "What was my father doing with a cattle ranch in Montana?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Harold Carter grew up here." "Did you know that?" "She did not. Left when he was about 22. Went east. Built a different life." Gerald removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief. "But he never sold the land. He kept paying the taxes every year, even when money was tight. Kept saying he'd come back to it someday." A pause. "He never did." Evelyn was quiet. "He kept a photograph on his desk," she said, almost to herself. "Mountains and fields. I always thought it was just a picture he liked." "That photograph was taken from the front porch of the farmhouse," Gerald said. "I recognize it. Harold showed it to me once." She arrived at the ranch on a gray afternoon, riding in the back of a borrowed wagon, driven by a local man named Eli, who talked about weather the entire way and seemed not to notice she wasn't responding. When the wagon stopped and she climbed down and looked at what was in front of her, she understood for the first time why Harold had never come back. Not because he didn't love it, but because some things are easier to love from a distance. The farmhouse was standing, but only just. The porch sagged on one side. The front window had been patched with a piece of board. The garden beds along the front were choked with dead weeds. The fields beyond the fence stretched brown and exhausted in every direction, and the silence was the kind that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels like abandonment. She walked through the house. She cataloged the damage with the same methodical attention she gave to filing systems at the office. Roof damage in the eastern bedroom, broken stove flue in the kitchen, warped floorboards in the hallway, cracked plaster in 3 rooms, a water pump that squeaked so badly she could feel it in her back teeth. She sat at Harold's kitchen table, her kitchen table now, and spread out the financial records Gerald had given her. And she did the arithmetic 3 times because she kept hoping she'd made an error. She had not made an error. The cattle were worth approximately $800 at current market prices if she could get them to a buyer before they lost more condition. The property itself, Gerald estimated, would fetch perhaps $2,000 from a motivated buyer. Reed's offer was $1,800, which told her exactly how motivated he was. The outstanding debt was $2,200. She was already underwater before she spent a single day on the land. She sat with that number until the sun went down and the kitchen got cold, and she realized she hadn't eaten since morning. She found a tin of crackers in the pantry and ate them at the table in the dark, and tried to hear Harold in the silence of the house. "What were you thinking?" she asked him. No answer came. Just the wind against the warped window and the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the dark. The next morning she woke before sunrise. Not because she planned to, she hadn't slept well, hadn't slept much at all, but because the silence in the house was so complete that the first bird calling outside sounded like a shout. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the land waking up around her, and then she got up because staying in bed felt like the first step toward going home, and she wasn't going home. She was outside, walking the fence line with a piece of paper and a pencil, making notes about what needed to be repaired, when she heard hoofbeats. The rider came from the east, from the direction of the neighboring property, moving at a steady pace that suggested a man accustomed to covering ground without hurrying. He was tall in the saddle. She noticed that before she noticed anything else about him, with the kind of posture that wasn't about pride, just efficiency. The posture of someone who had spent so much time on a horse that the horse and the man had reached an agreement. He stopped at the fence line, about 10 feet from where she was standing. His horse was a dark bay, well-kept, patient. The man looked at her with eyes the color of winter water, not cold, exactly, but not warm either. Assessing. "You're the Carter girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Evelyn Carter," she said, "and I'm 28, so." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition that he'd made an error in phrasing and was filing that information away. "William Dawson," he said. "My property's east of yours." "I know. The lawyer mentioned you." He looked at the paper in her hand. "What are you doing?" "Cataloging the fence damage." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because it's damaged." He looked at the fence. He looked back at her. "You're going to need more than a piece of paper." "I know. I'll get to that." He sat on his horse and said nothing for a moment, looking at the fence line, and she had the sense that he was doing his own cataloging, not of the fence, but of her. She didn't look away. She had been looked at her whole life by people who expected her to fold, and she had learned a long time ago that the trick was simply not to. "The south pasture fence is the worst of it," he said finally. "If those cattle get through before you've got it repaired, you'll be running them down for 2 days. "Thank you," she said. "I'll start there." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. She watched him go. She didn't know yet what to make of him. She didn't know yet that William Dawson had told exactly one person in the last 3 years what the South Pasture situation was, and that person had been Pete Sully, who had nodded and done nothing about it. She didn't know yet that Will had ridden over this morning, expecting to find exactly what everyone else in Dawson Creek expected: a city woman standing on her front porch, looking lost. He had not expected to find her walking the fence line at dawn, with a piece of paper and a pencil, making her own list. He didn't say any of that, but he thought about it all the way home. The first real crisis came on day 4. She had been trying to move 3 of the weaker cattle from the south field to the smaller paddock closer to the barn, where she could keep a better eye on them. The plan was simple, the execution was not. The cattle did not want to move. The cattle, she discovered, had opinions, and their primary opinion was that they were comfortable where they were, and did not see any reason to change. She spent an hour and a half trying to move 3 animals approximately 400 yards. She ended up in the mud. She was sitting in the mud, breathing hard, her skirt ruined, one of the cattle standing about 2 feet from her, and looking at her with the profound indifference that only large animals can achieve. When she heard hoofbeats again, William Dawson appeared at the fence, looked at the situation, and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. "Before you say anything," she said from the mud, "I know." "What do you know?" "I know I look ridiculous. I know this isn't going the way I planned. I know everyone in this town thinks I can't do this." She paused. "Are you here to agree with them?" He dismounted slowly, tied his horse to the fence post, walked through the gate and approached the cattle with a different kind of movement than she'd been using, slower, more angled, less direct. "Watch," he said. She watched. It took him 4 minutes to move all 3 cattle to exactly where she'd been trying to get them. She sat in the mud and watched every single second of it. "How?" she said. "Don't come at them straight on. Come from the side. Give them somewhere to go before you ask them to go there." She processed that. They need to see the path before they'll take it. He looked at her. "Most things do." She got up out of the mud. "Will you show me how to do it? I've got my own work." "I know you do, and I'm not asking you to do mine. I'm asking you to show me how." There it was again, that expression she couldn't quite read. That slight shift behind the Winterwater eyes. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Sunrise." He went back to his horse without waiting for her to thank him. She called after him anyway. "Mr. Dawson," he looked back. "The cattle thing, giving them somewhere to go before you ask them to move. Does that work with people too?" He didn't answer. But she saw the corner of his mouth move. That was enough. The next morning she was at his fence line before the sun was fully up. He was already there, which told her something about the kind of man he was. The kind who kept his word quietly and showed up slightly ahead of schedule, as if being on time was a form of respect he gave, whether or not he had to. He taught her how to read the cattle, not their behavior. In a general sense, she'd read enough books on the train from Boston to know the basics, but their specific behavior. This particular herd, these animals, with their habits and their preferences, and their particular way of communicating distress versus irritation versus simple stubbornness. He knew each one, she realized. Not by name, he wasn't sentimental about it, but by character. That one, she said, pointing to a large roan that had given her particular trouble the day before. What's wrong with her? She's not wrong, she's careful. She was at the front of the herd when the coyotes came through last spring. She doesn't move until she knows where it's safe. How do I earn her trust? He looked at her for a moment. Then he handed her a pail. Feed her yourself every morning. Same time, she'll get used to me. She'll decide you're not a threat. That's different. Evelyn thought about that distinction for the rest of the day. Henry Dawson came to the ranch on a Wednesday, which she later learned was unusual because Henry Dawson did not make social calls, had not made a social call in years, and had told his son on no fewer than 3 occasions that community relations were a waste of good working hours. He arrived at the front gate, tied his horse, and knocked on the door with the knock of a man who expected it to be answered. He was 65 and looked like the land itself, weathered and substantial and not going anywhere. His handshake was a declaration. Henry Dawson, he said. Will's father. Evelyn Carter, she said. Harold's daughter. He nodded, as if this confirmed something. Can I see what you've done with the south fence? She walked him out to the south pasture. He walked the line slowly, examining her work, saying nothing. She walked beside him and said nothing either, because she understood intuitively that this was a man for whom silence was a form of attention, and she wanted to give him hers. Finally, at the corner post, he stopped. That splice is wrong, he said, pointing. She looked. How should it be done? He showed her. Standing there in the field, with no preamble, no softening, just the direct passing of information from someone who knew to someone who needed to know. She memorized every movement of his hands. Will didn't teach you this part, he asked. He taught me the line, not the corners. Henry looked back toward the house. Harold was a good man, he said. It came out of nowhere, and she felt the weight of it. Yes, she said, he loved this land, couldn't make himself come back to it. Too much tied up in it. He looked at her. You're not like him. No, she agreed, I'm not. That's not a criticism. It's an observation. He started walking back toward the gate. Corners matter more than the lines, he said, without looking back. Remember that. She stood in the south field after he left and wrote it down. 3 weeks in, she found the financial record Harold had kept in a locked box under the kitchen floor. The key was on a ring, with 3 other keys she hadn't yet identified, and she'd been trying each lock she could find, the way Harold had always taught her to match keys, methodically, without assuming anything. Inside the box was a ledger and a letter. The ledger tracked every payment Harold had made on the property for 23 years. Property taxes, small repairs contracted out to local hands. Feed supplements when the previous tenant's cattle struggled. The numbers were careful and precise, of course they were. Harold had been an accountant. He saw those nows numbered. Was a picture of a man who had stayed connected to a place he could not bring himself to return to. The letter was addressed to her, in Harold's handwriting. She stood at the kitchen table and held it for a long time before she opened it. Evelyn, it began. If you're reading this, then you've done exactly what I hoped you went. I couldn't go back. I want to be honest with you about that. 'Cause I always tried with you about the things that mattered. I couldn't go back because I left something there that I should have fought for. And I knew that going back would mean looking at all the ways I hadn't. But you've never run from hard things. I've watched you your whole life refuse to let hard things stay hard. You find a way through. This land needs someone who will find a way through. I believe that person is you. I'm sorry for the debt. I'm sorry for the mess, but I am not sorry for believing in you. The neighbor to the east is a good man, even if he doesn't know it right now. Trust him slowly. He's earned caution, Dad. She folded the letter and put it back in the box and locked it again. Then she went outside and started on the barn repairs, because staying inside with that letter felt like something that could break her, and she had decided she was not going to break. Thomas Reed appeared on a Friday. He arrived in a good coat and a clean hat, which told her immediately that this visit was not casual. He had the smile of a man who had purchased many things from people who needed money, and had learned to frame the transaction as generosity. "Miss Carter," he said at the front gate, "I wonder if we might speak." "About what?" "About your situation," he said it gently. "I know this must be overwhelming. Coming here alone, without experience, facing all of this debt." He spread his hands. "I want you to know I don't see you as someone who failed. I see you as someone who was put in an impossible position." "What are you offering?" he told her. $1,800 for the property and the remaining cattle. Clean transfer. She could be on a train back to Boston within the week. "The debt is $2,200, she said. "I know. I'll absorb the difference." He tilted his head slightly. "Consider it a courtesy." She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I appreciate your coming all the way out here. But I'm going to need you to leave now." His expression shifted just slightly, just enough to show her what was underneath the clean hat and the gentle voice. "Miss Carter, I'm trying to help you." "I know what you're trying to do," she said. "And the answer is no." He left. She watched his wagon disappear down the road, and then stood at the gate for a while, breathing slowly, steadying herself. Because the truth was, in that moment she had been tempted. Not by the money, by the relief. The idea of putting this weight down and going back to her small apartment and her filing systems and the life she understood. She heard a footstep behind her. William Dawson was at the fence, having appeared with the silent efficiency she was starting to recognize as simply how he moved through the world. He had apparently ridden over and tied his horse at the far post, and she hadn't heard him because she'd been too focused on Reed's retreating wagon. "I see Thomas paid a visit," he said. $1,800, she said. "He offered me the same when my father was sick. Said he was doing me a favor." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said the same thing you said." He paused. "I heard you from the road." She almost laughed. "That honest?" "You've got a clear voice," he said. "Nothing wrong with that." She turned back toward the house. "The barn's east wall needs shoring up before the weather turns. Gerald says we've got 3 weeks, maybe 4, before the first hard frost. I'll come by tomorrow with my post driver," he said. "Earlier the better." She stopped and looked back at him. "You don't have to. I know. Your father told me neighbors help each other because the land is bigger than any of us." He looked at her steadily. "He told you that?" He said, "A good neighbor doesn't do your work for you. A good neighbor shows you how to do it yourself." She tilted her head slightly. Though he didn't seem opposed to showing up with a post driver when the occasion called for it. For the first time, the very first time, William Dawson did something she hadn't seen him do. He dropped his head slightly, and she saw in that movement the ghost of a smile. Not performed, not offered for her benefit, just present for a moment, before he controlled it back. 6:30, he said. "Don't be late." She wasn't late. She was there at 6:15, and so was he, and they worked the east wall of the barn side by side through the morning. And what she noticed, what she kept noticing, was that he had stopped explaining things, and started simply working alongside her, as if somewhere in the last few weeks his assessment of her competence had quietly shifted, and he had decided she no longer needed instruction on every step, just company in the doing of it. That felt, she thought, like something. The question was what? She didn't pursue the question. She picked up her end of the beam, and she worked, because the barn needed doing, and because she had learned from William, from Henry, from 63 stubborn cattle, from the roan who needed to see the safe path before she'd take it, that in this place, the doing was the only language that meant anything. The barn wall held, and at the end of the day, as the light was going golden across the fields, and the cattle were settling in the repaired south pasture, and the barn stood solid against the coming cold. She stood on the front porch of the farmhouse that had been her father's, and looked out at the land and understood for the first time what Harold had seen in that photograph he'd kept on his desk. Not an ending. A beginning that had been waiting for someone to come back to it. She breathed in the cold air. She thought about the letter in the box, under the kitchen floor. She thought about the roan, who had finally that morning, for the first time, walked to the pail without hesitating. She thought about William Dawson, riding away in the last light, his posture straight and unhurried, a man who had started saying more and couldn't seem to explain why. She went inside and made coffee and sat at Harold's table with her ledger and her list of what still needed to be done, and the list was long, longer than she could reasonably face in one sitting. And the debt was still real, and Thomas Reed would come back, and the winter was coming. But the barn wall held, and sometimes, she was learning, you take the small proofs and you build from them. The frost came early, not the killing frost, not yet, but the kind that put a white edge on everything before sunrise and reminded the land, and everyone on it, that patience had a limit. Evelyn felt it the morning after the barn wall was finished, when she stepped outside at first light, and her breath made a cloud in front of her face, and the ground under her boots had gone slightly hard overnight. She stood on the porch and looked at the fields, and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding all week. How many weeks of workable weather remained, how much still needed to be done, how little she actually knew about doing any of it. The list had grown since she'd started keeping it. That was the nature of this kind of work. She was learning every problem you solved, introduced you to 3 more you hadn't known existed. The water trough in the north paddock had a slow leak. She'd patched twice with mixed results. The feed supply Gerald had helped her arrange was sufficient for 6 weeks, but the cattle needed to be in better condition before the hard cold arrived, and better condition required more feed, and more feed required money she didn't have, and money she didn't have required selling cattle she couldn't afford to lose. The equation kept eating itself. She was standing at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the coffee going cold beside her when she heard the horse. She didn't look up immediately. She had started to recognize the particular cadence of William Dawson's bay on the road, a steady 4-beat rhythm, unhurried, consistent the way you learn to recognize a specific knock on a door. She waited until it stopped, until she heard the creak of the gate, and then she went to the door. He was carrying something, a grain sack over his shoulder and a tool bag in his other hand. He didn't say good morning. He said the north trough. You've been patching it wrong. Good morning to you too, she said. He set the grain sack down on the porch. The seal needs to be done from inside the trough, not outside. You've been applying it to the surface, and the water pressure pushes it back out every time. How do you know how I've been applying it? Because I looked at it. She stared at him. When? Tuesday. When you were working the south fence. She processed that. He had ridden over, looked at her trough repair, assessed what she was doing wrong, said nothing at the time, and come back 2 days later with the correct materials. She couldn't decide if that was maddening or quietly, in a way she didn't quite want to examine something else. You could have told me on Tuesday, she said. You were busy. I'm always busy, I know, he said, and the way he said it simply, without edge, landed differently than she expected. Not like a criticism, like he'd been paying attention. He fixed the trough in 40 minutes. She watched the first 20, then got down in next to him and helped with the last 20 because watching felt like a waste of her time and his. He corrected her twice, briefly, without making it into anything larger than it was. And she adjusted without arguing because she had learned by now that his corrections were accurate, and his manner of delivering them was the most efficient she'd encountered, no patience wasted on softening what simply needed to be said. When they were done, he rinsed his hands in the clean water and looked at the result. It'll hold, he said. Thank you. He picked up his tool bag. She thought he was leaving. Then he didn't leave. He stood there with the bag in his hand, looking at nothing particular, and she had the impression of a man searching for words the way someone searches for a tool they know they own but haven't used in a long time. "The feed situation," he said. "I'm aware of it. My herd's doing better this season than last. I've got surplus you can buy at cost, not market rate." She was quiet for a moment. "That's generous. It's practical. If your herd collapses, you'll have to sell the land." "Reed buys it. His property borders mine on two sides already." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a situation I want." She almost smiled. "So you're helping me out of self-interest." "I'm helping you because it makes sense." He paused. "The other thing doesn't have to be the only reason." She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, then picked up the grain sack and handed it to her. "This one's to start. Bring the wagon Thursday, and we'll transfer the rest." He left before she could find the right thing to say. She stood holding the grain sack and watched him ride back toward his property and thought, "Harold, you said trust him slowly." But slowly is getting harder to manage. The Thursday transfer introduced her to a part of William Dawson's operation she hadn't seen, the organized, precise machinery of a ranch that worked because one's man had spent years ensuring every piece of it functioned correctly. His barn was ordered in a way that made her own feel like a shipwreck. His cattle were in visibly better condition. Even his horses seemed calmer, as if they'd absorbed his particular brand of quiet. His father was there, sitting on a fence post, watching the loading with the judicious attention of a man who had opinions about everything and had learned over many decades which ones were worth voicing. "You've put weight on those three weaker ones," Henry said to her, without preamble. "The feed change and the paddock rotation," she said. "I moved them away from the dominant animals, so they could eat without competition." Henry looked at Will. Will said nothing, but something in his stillness suggested approval, or at least the recognition of a thing done correctly. "Harold tried that rotation system in his first year," Henry said. "Gave up on it because it required moving the fence panels twice a week." "It does," Evelyn agreed. "It's inconvenient, but you're still doing it." "The results are inconvenient to argue with." Henry made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Will," he said, without looking at his son, "this one's going to be trouble for you." She looked at William. William looked at the middle distance, with the concentration of a man who had decided that fence posts were the most interesting thing in his immediate environment. She let it go, but she didn't forget it. The first time she fell off a horse happened on a Saturday, in front of three of her cattle, two of William's ranch hands, who had ridden over to help her with a fence extension, and William himself, who had the particular misfortune of arriving at exactly the wrong moment. It wasn't entirely her fault. The horse, a steady older gelding she'd bought from the livery, chosen specifically because Eli the livery man had described him as unexcitable, had spooked at a ground squirrel. The horse recovered immediately. Evelyn did not remain on the horse long enough to share in the recovery. She hit the ground hard. The breath left her body. The three cattle observed this event with their customary indifference. The two ranch hands went very still in the way of men who aren't sure whether they're allowed to react. William had dismounted before she'd finished processing what had happened. "Don't move," he said. "I'm fine." I said, "Don't move." And I said, "I'm fine." She sat up, which proved the case. Everything hurt, but in the diffuse, widespread way of impact rather than the specific, pointed way of something broken. She took stock of herself. Nothing alarming. She looked up. William was crouched in front of her, and the expression on his face was not the controlled, careful neutrality she'd grown accustomed to. It was something more immediate than that. His hands were at her shoulders, not gripping, just present, steadying. And he was looking at her with an attention that had nothing measured about it. "I'm fine," she said more quietly this time. He sat back on his heels. Let out a breath. The control came back, but slowly. "You weren't holding the rein properly," he said. His voice had recovered its even tone, but there was a half-second lag before it got there that she noticed. "I know. We're going to fix that today. You don't have to. We're going to fix it today." he said again, and stood and offered her his hand. Took it. He pulled her up. Let go immediately. The way a man lets go of something when holding it feels like more than the situation officially calls for. She brushed herself off. The two ranch hands had discovered very urgent work to attend to in the opposite direction. She looked at the gelding, who was standing nearby, looking apologetic in the specific way of horses who've committed an embarrassing error. "All right," she said. "Show me the rein." He spent an hour with her, working through the mechanics she'd thought she understood and clearly hadn't, and what struck her about that hour was not the instruction itself, it was the patience of it. William Dawson, who measured his words so carefully and spent them like a man who'd learned to make limited resources last, had infinite patience for this. For teaching, she watched his hands on the rein, demonstrating, and saw in them the hands of a man who had been doing this long enough that knowledge had become physical, lived in the body rather than the mind. And the only way to transfer it was to show it over and over until it lived in her body too. "You trust the horse," he said. "You're not managing it, you're working with it. That's what you do. That's what you need to do. How long did it take you to learn it?" He thought about that for a moment. "I don't remember not knowing it. My father put me on a horse before I could walk properly. That seems like a significant head start." He looked at her. "You've made up more ground in 2 months than some people do in 2 years. She heard that. Let it sit for 2 and without deflecting it, without saying something practical to cover it over. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me," she said. He looked away. "Don't tell anyone." She laughed. Actually laughed, and it surprised both of them, not because laughter was strange, but because it had been so long since this land had heard it from her, in that unguarded way, with nothing cautious in it. He looked at her when she laughed, the way you look at something that startles you and turns out to be good. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away. That was the first shift, and she felt it, and she filed it away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to examine. Thomas Reed came back on a Monday. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man she didn't recognize, younger, well-dressed, with the city look she'd apparently had herself 2 months ago, and could now identify at a distance. He introduced him as Mr. Calvert, a land assessor from Billings. "I've taken the liberty of having the property formally assessed," Reed said at her gate. "Given that we couldn't come to terms on my previous offer, I wanted to ensure you had accurate information about what you're working with." She looked at the assessor. "Did Mr. Reed commission your assessment?" Calvert hesitated. "The bank holds the note on this property, so technically." "The bank holds the debt," she said. "It does not hold the property." "Not yet." She looked at Reed. "You had someone assess my land without my knowledge or consent. It's standard procedure for Mr. Reed." She kept her voice very level. "I know what this is. You're building a case for foreclosure that moves faster than the legal timeline. You want me to see a number from an outside assessor and decide the fight isn't worth it." She paused. "Am I close?" Something hardened behind his smile. "Miss Carter, I'm simply trying to. Come back with a legal notice or don't come back at all," she said. "Have a good afternoon." She closed the gate. She stood on the inside of it, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, and breathed until her heartbeat came down from where it had gone during that conversation. And then she walked back to the house with her head up, because she knew she could feel it, with the certainty you feel when you've been watched from a property line that William Dawson had ridden up, while Reed was still at the gate and had seen all of it. He was at her back fence when she came around the side of the house. "You should have let me come to the gate," he said. "Why? Because Reed doesn't respect," he stopped. "Because Reed doesn't respect women who stand alone," she finished for him. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That's not what I meant." "It might be what you meant, and you might not be wrong about how Reed thinks." She sat down on the fence rail, not gracefully, not carefully, just sat down because her legs were suddenly tired from holding her up through that conversation. "But if I let you fight that battle for me, I lose it in a different way." You understand that. He was quiet for a moment. Then yes. He's going to come back. I know. I need to know exactly what the legal timeline is. I need to know the payment schedule, what triggers foreclosure, what rights I have before it reaches that point. She looked at him. Do you know a lawyer who isn't Gerald? Gerald is good, but he's also friends with Reed, and I've started wondering if that's a problem. William thought about it. Billings. There's a man named Fraser. He does land disputes. Can you get me an introduction? He looked at her for a long moment. I'll ride to Billings Wednesday. You want to come? I want to come. Then be ready at 5. She was ready at 4:30. He arrived at 5 and looked at her standing at the gate and said nothing about the fact that she'd clearly been waiting for a while, and she said nothing about the fact that he'd brought a second horse, his own second horse, not a livery animal, which was saddled with the careful attention he gave everything he did, which meant he'd saddled it that morning and ridden with it all the way over. They rode to Billings in the early light, and it was the longest consecutive stretch of time she had spent in his company, 6 hours in each direction, and what happened in those hours was not dramatic. They talked about practical things, the legal timeline, the debt structure, what Fraser would need to know. They talked about the cattle. At some point, without deciding to, they talked about Boston, and she told him about the filing office, and the long tables of ledgers and the particular quality of light through the east-facing windows in the afternoon. And he listened the way he did everything completely, without performing attention, just actually attending. He told her about the ranch when he'd first inherited it. His father's slow decline, the years of working someone else's land while managing his own, the first winter he'd spent truly alone. Not the facts of it, just the shape of it, the weight. She didn't push for more. She understood by now that William offered things in pieces, on his own schedule, and that pushing was exactly the wrong response. So she accepted what he gave, and they rode, and the miles opened up between them and the ranch, and Thomas Reed, and the debt and the dead grass and all of it, just for those hours. And she thought, this is what it would feel like if none of it were falling apart. If it were just this. Fraser was a compact, sharp-eyed man who listened to everything she said, asked 7 questions that demonstrated he had actually heard all of it, and told her that Reed's independent assessment is more aggressive, but not technically improper, that the foreclosure timeline had specific statutory protections she could use, and that there were 2 options that could buy her significantly more time than she'd expected. She leaned forward in her chair. Tell me, he told her. On the ride back she was quiet for a long time, processing. William let her be. They were perhaps 2 hours from the ranch when she spoke. He said, if I can make one partial payment against the principal, not the full debt, just a meaningful partial, it resets the foreclosure clock. How much? $400 by December. He was quiet. I know, she said. I know what the ledger looks like. There might be a way, he said. She looked at him. The cattle you've been conditioning. The 3 weekers have come up enough. If you sell those 3 plus 2 of the mid-range animals at the fall market in Helena, you're close. Not 400, but close. How close? Depends on the market. 320, maybe 350, that's not 400. No, he paused. But I have a steer I've been holding back for sale that I'd planned to move in the spring. I could bring him to Helena. She stared at him. That's your profit margin for the season. It's one steer, Evelyn, he said her name. Her first name. He had not said it before, it had been Miss Carter, or nothing, and hearing it in his voice, said simply, without decoration, was like hearing a door open in a room she'd been working around for months. I've got a good season, I can absorb it. She looked at the road ahead. The land was doing its evening thing, going gold and long, the shadows stretching out, everything softening at the edges, the way only late light could manage. You told me on the first day, she said, that you weren't going to run my ranch. I'm not running your ranch, you're financing it. I'm selling a steer at the same market you're selling yours. What you do with your profit is your business. She shook her head. Not in refusal, just at the precision of the man. The way he'd constructed that sentence to make it something she could accept, without it becoming something she owed. Why, she said, not arguing, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. My wife's name was Catherine, he said. She went still. She would have liked you. Not because you remind me of her, you don't, not particularly. But because she believed people were worth the trouble of believing in. He kept his eyes on the road. I stopped believing that for a while. It's easier, not believing it. Less costly, and now he glanced at her, just briefly. And now it's getting harder to maintain the position. She didn't speak. She understood she had learned by now to understand that he had given her something in that moment that cost him considerably, and that the correct response was not to make it into more than it was, or rush toward what it might mean. The correct response was simply to receive it, and let him know she had. I'm sorry about Catherine, she said. I know. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the kind of silence that has had something added to it, that sits differently than it did before. And she felt the weight of the ranch ahead of her, and the debt, and Reed, and all of it, returning as the lights of Dawson Creek appeared in the distance, and felt, underneath all of that, something else. Something that had been building since the south fence, and the mud, and the barn wall, and a man who showed up before sunrise, and said, "Don't be late," and meant it as a form of respect. She didn't name it yet, but she knew what it was. Back at the ranch, she set the lantern on the kitchen table, and opened the ledger, and worked the numbers for 2 hours. The Helena market was 4 weeks out. 4 weeks to bring the 5 cattle to their best possible condition. 4 weeks to arrange transport and negotiate terms and do everything else that needed doing before she could think about December and the partial payment and the foreclosure clock. And Thomas Reed's face when she proved him wrong. She was still at the table when she heard the sound. Low, from the direction of the south paddock. Not a distress sound, not quite, but the kind of sound one of the cattle made when something wasn't right. The in-between sound that she'd learned to distinguish from normal nighttime noise. She took the lantern and went out. The roan was down. Not catastrophically, not the down that means the end, but down in the way that meant something was wrong and needed addressing immediately. Evelyn was on her knees beside the animal, before she'd consciously made the decision to do so, her hands moving over the roan's side, checking, assessing, running through everything Will had taught her, about what to look for, and what it meant. Colic, she thought, early stages maybe, or something else in the gut that needed attention. She made a decision. She ran to the fence line. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and gave the whistle, the specific carry-across distance whistle, that she'd practiced for exactly this kind of situation, the one William had taught her, and told her to use if she needed it. Him and hadn't seemed to expect she'd need it soon. 6 minutes later, she heard hoofbeats. He came through the gate with his medical bag, already in his hand, which meant he'd been awake, or nearly, or had been awake for long enough to keep the bag where he could reach it. He got down beside the roan, without asking what had happened, assessed her for 30 seconds, and looked up at Evelyn. "You were right to call me," he said. "She'll be fine. But she needs to be up and moving. Go to the other side." She went to the other side. They worked together in the dark, moving the roan, keeping her moving, walking her in slow circles, while Will monitored and administered and told her what to watch for, and she watched for it. And the hours passed the way they do when focus replaces time, and at some point before sunrise, the roan steadied, settled, and put her nose into the feed bucket with the purposeful hunger of an animal that has decided to be well. Evelyn stood in the paddock and let out a long breath. "You read her right," Will said. "If you'd waited another hour." "I almost waited," she said. "I kept second-guessing myself. I thought I was overreacting. You weren't. I know that now." She looked at the roan. "She trusts me." "Yes," he said. "She didn't before." "You said she had to decide I wasn't a threat," she decided. Evelyn looked at him across the back of the roan, in the almost dark, in the hour before the land woke up. She thought about Catherine, and about the door she'd heard open earlier in the day. She thought about the way he'd said her name, and about the steer he was going to bring to Helena, and about the expression on his face when she'd hit the ground, and he'd reached her before she'd finished processing the fall. She thought, I am not going to be the one who says it first. Not because she was afraid, but because there were some things this man needed to come to at his own pace, and she understood that now, the way she understood the roan. You give them somewhere to go before you ask them to move. You wait until they choose. Go home, she said, sleep. Come back when you've slept. He looked at her for a moment. You'll be all right. I've been all right, she said. That's the whole point, he almost smiled, got his horse. Rode back through the gate in the last of the darkness. She stayed with the roan until the sun came up, and the roan let her, and when the light finally broke across the fields, and the day started its noise, Evelyn Carter stood up straight, put her hand briefly on the animal's warm neck, and went inside to make coffee and open the ledger and keep going. Because there was still $400 to make, and a December deadline to meet, and a silent cowboy who had started talking more, and the list of what needed doing was still long. But the roan had made her choice, and so quietly, irrevocably had she. The Helena market was in 3 weeks, and Evelyn spent every one of those days, like she was spending money she didn't have carefully, deliberately, with the constant awareness that she couldn't afford to waste a single hour. She had 5 cattle to bring to condition. She had a partial payment deadline in December that felt both very far away and entirely too close. She had a bank that was watching her with the patience of something that knows it doesn't have to hurry. And she had a silent cowboy who had said her name once, 2 weeks ago, on a road outside Billings, and had not repeated the experiment since, which told her he was thinking about it. She was thinking about it too. She just didn't have time to think about it the way it deserved. The 5 cattle responded well to the intensive feeding regimen she and Will had agreed on. The 3 weaker animals, the ones she'd rotated away from the dominant herd members back in September, had come up noticeably, since then their ribs less visible, their coats developing the kind of density that suggested a body working properly rather than merely surviving. She checked them every morning and every evening, running her hands along their sides with the practiced attention she'd had to build from nothing. And the satisfaction of feeling a body strengthen under her hands was the kind of satisfaction she hadn't known existed before she came to Montana. Before this land, before the work. She was doing the evening check 10 days before the market when Will appeared at the paddock gate. He had a look she'd learned to read, not the controlled neutrality of his default expression, but the version of it that had a specific weight behind it, when something had happened that he was deciding how to tell her. What, she said. Reed paid a visit to the market organizer in Helena. She went still, and he's been suggesting to buyers that the Carter herd has a health problem. Nothing official, just talk, the kind of talk that gets around. She stared at him. He can't do that, he's not doing it officially. He's doing it the way men like Reed do things. Quietly, where it can't be traced back. He's trying to undercut my prices before I even get there. Yes. She turned away from the paddock and walked 3 steps in no particular direction, and then stopped, because walking away from things was not something she did. She turned back. Her hands were pressed flat against her sides. She had learned that pressing them flat when she wanted to make them fists was a more productive use of the energy. How many buyers has this reached? I don't know yet. My foreman, Cal, heard it from a man at the general store in Helena who'd heard it from someone else. Could be contained, could be wider. Can we counter it? We'd have to get to Helena early. Talk to the buyers before the market opens. Let them look at the cattle themselves. Then that's what we do. She looked at him. How early? Day before. Get there the night before the market. Have the cattle available for inspection that evening. That means leaving 2 days earlier than planned. Yes. She went through the ledger in her head. She had memorized enough of it that she could do the arithmetic without the book. The extra 2 days meant arranging earlier transport, which would cost more. which would eat into the margin she'd already calculated, down to the dollar. The money still works, she said, more to herself than to him. Barely is enough. She looked at the cattle. He's doing this because he knows the market money is the difference between me making the December payment and not making it. Yes, he knows about the payment plan. Will hesitated. Just half a second, but she caught it. Gerald, she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Gerald Oates, the lawyer who was friends with Thomas Reed. The lawyer she'd shared the Fraser payment plan with, because she'd needed legal documentation, and Gerald was still technically her attorney of record. She had thought about this. She had decided Gerald was not actively working against her, just caught between loyalties in the way of men who'd been in small towns too long. But this, he told Reed about the December deadline, she said. I don't know that for certain. You don't have to know it for certain. If Reed knows exactly when I need to make the payment, and exactly how much I need to make it, and suddenly the cattle market I'm depending on has a rumor problem, that's not coincidence. Will looked at her steadily. No, it's not, she breathed in slowly. Let it out. I need a new lawyer. Fraser said he'd take you on directly. She looked at him. You already called Fraser. I sent a wire this morning. She stared at him for a moment. He had not asked her. He had not asked whether she wanted him to, or whether she was comfortable with it, or whether she'd prefer to handle it herself. He had simply identified the problem, identified the solution, and taken the action, and was now telling her about it, after the fact. Under normal circumstances, that would have annoyed her. She had spent her life being acted upon by men who thought they knew better. But this was not that. She knew the difference now. This was a man who had watched her fight for 4 months, and had accurately assessed that in this specific instance, the wire needed to go out immediately, and she was standing in a field with her hands in a cow's coat, and every hour mattered. Thank you, she said. He nodded. We leave Wednesday at 4. I'll be ready. I know you will. He left. She turned back to the cattle, but her mind was working the problem from every angle. Reed, Gerald, the market, the December deadline, the margin that was barely enough and needed to stay barely enough. She was so deep in the arithmetic that she almost missed it. The roan had walked to the fence rail and put her head over it toward Evelyn, not asking for anything specifically, just present, the way she'd started doing in recent weeks. Just choosing to be close. Evelyn put her hand on the roan's nose and stood there a moment. I'm keeping you, she said to the roan. You're not one of the 5. Just so you know. The roan breathed warm air against her palm. She went inside and packed a bag. The ride to Helena took most of Wednesday. Will brought Cal, his foreman, a rangy man of about 50, with a sun-damaged face and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be amused by most of it, and Evelyn rode with them, the 5 cattle, moving in a loose group ahead of them. Manageable in the way that cattle are manageable, when they've been handled consistently and understand the people handling them. Cal said very little for the first 3 hours. Then he looked at her and said, without particular preamble, You're the one fixed the Carter herd's rotation problem. I am, she said. Will said you figured it out yourself. She glanced at Will, who was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a man who had not said anything of the sort, and was therefore not required to respond. Mr. Dawson showed me the principle, she said carefully. I applied it. Cal made a sound that suggested he was crediting her anyway. Will doesn't show people much. He's shown you more than he's shown most hands who've worked for him. She said nothing to that, but she felt Will's attention shift toward her, not his gaze, just his awareness, in that peripheral way she'd developed a sensitivity to over these months. How's Henry? She asked to redirect. Slower this winter, Cal said. Won't admit it, which means he's exactly as stubborn as you'd expect. He glanced at Will. Mentions Miss Carter about every 3rd day, which, for Henry, is the equivalent of another man bringing it up hourly. Cal, Will said. I'm stating facts, Cal said placidly. They arrived in Helena as the light was failing. Will had arranged for the cattle to be held in a pen at the edge of the market grounds, accessible for viewing. He sent Cal to the market office to register them, while he and Evelyn went to find two buyers he'd already identified as the most likely targets of Reed's rumor. The first was a rancher named Abbott, a large, weathered man who had the specific wariness of someone who'd been burned by a bad purchase before. He looked at the cattle, looked at Evelyn, and heard there was a sickness in the Carter herd. From who, she said. Doesn't matter from who. It matters considerably from who, she said. If it came from someone with a financial interest in these cattle being devalued, it matters. If it came from someone with actual evidence of illness, that also matters, but in a different direction. She paused. So, who told you? Abbott looked at Will. Will looked at the middle distance. Friend of Reed's, Abbott said finally. Thomas Reed has made 3 formal offers on my property, Evelyn said. Each one below market value. He would benefit directly from these cattle, not selling, or selling at a reduced price, because it prevents me from making a legal debt payment and accelerates his ability to acquire the property. She gestured to the pen. Look at them, not my description of them. Look at them yourself. He looked. He looked for a long time, walking the fence, looking at specific animals with the attention of a man who actually knew what healthy cattle looked like. The roan isn't in the sale group, he said. No. Why not? She's the best one. She stays, Evelyn said. Simply finally. Abbott looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted. What are you asking per head, he said. She told him. He countered. She held her number for 40 seconds, then came down $8 per animal, which was exactly as far as she'd planned to come down. He looked at Will. She always negotiate like this? Yes, Will said. Abbott looked back at Evelyn. Done. For 4 of the 5. The 5th as well, she said. The 5th is the thinnest. The 5th has gained 30 pounds in 6 weeks. Come back in the morning, when the light's better, and look again. Abbott looked at her for another moment. Then he almost smiled. Morning, he agreed. The second buyer was harder. A man named Creel, who had clearly heard a more detailed version of Reed's rumor, specific, enough that Evelyn suspected it hadn't just come from a friend of Reed's, but from Reed himself, or from someone he'd paid to make the rounds. Creel had his arms crossed before she'd finished speaking. He had already decided. I don't buy cattle with a question mark on them, he said. There's no question mark, she said. I've got a man who says otherwise. I've got a vet who says otherwise. She looked at Will. Will had anticipated this. He pulled a folded document from his coat. A health assessment. She hadn't known he'd arranged until this moment. Signed by the veterinarian who had attended the roan 6 weeks ago and had, apparently, assessed all 5 market cattle at the same time. She looked at Will. He did not look back, simply held the document out to her, and she took it and handed it to Creel. He read it, looked up. The crossed arms came down slightly. Dawson's name is on this, he said. He's my neighbor, Evelyn said. He's also putting his steer in this market, yes. His steer is not my concern, my cattle are. Creel looked at Will. You vouch for this herd? Will met his eyes directly. I've worked alongside this herd for 4 months. I've seen the rotation program, the feeding, the health management. I'd put my own cattle beside these, without hesitation. That landed. She could see it land. Because William Dawson's opinion in this community was not a casual thing, it was the opinion of a man who didn't offer his name to situations lightly, and whose word was the nearest thing to a written guarantee that this part of Montana had. Creel studied the document again. I'll look in the morning. We'll be here, she said. They ate dinner at the hotel restaurant, she and Will and Cal, at a corner table, with the practical quietness of people who have worked a long day and are processing the results. Cal ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed meals as fuel and conversation as optional. Will drank his coffee and looked at the table, and she could see him working something over in his mind. You knew about the vet assessment, she said. I arranged it last week. After you heard about Reed and the rumor, before, he said. When you first told me the plan, I thought if something goes wrong, you need documentation. It seemed like something worth having. She looked at him. You thought about this weeks ago. I think about problems before they're problems. It's a habit. Most people would call that worrying. Most people waste their worry on things they can't do anything about. He looked up. I try to worry in advance and take action. So by the time the problem arrives, I've already done something about it. She sat with that for a moment. Then, you did that for me. For the situation, he said. But he didn't look away when he said it, which told her that for the situation was not the whole sentence. Cal looked up from his plate, looked at the two of them, looked back at his plate with the serene expression of a man who was going to have a lot to tell Henry Dawson when they got home. The morning came cold and bright, the kind of Helena morning that was beautiful in the specific way of things that are trying to freeze you to death. Evelyn was at the cattle pen before the market officially opened, and Abbott arrived at the time he'd said he would, which she appreciated, and Creel arrived 20 minutes after Abbott, which she'd expected. Both of them looked at the cattle in the morning light. Both of them made their decisions. She sold all 5. Not at the number she'd originally hoped. Reed's rumor had done some damage, and the market was tighter than the year before, but at a number that, combined with Will's steer, would land her close enough to the December payment that the gap could be closed by other means she'd already identified. $360. She stood at the edge of the market grounds with the money in her coat pocket and did the arithmetic one more time. She needed $400. She had $360. She needed $40 more in 6. She could do that. She knew she could do that. Through the wool sale she'd arranged for December, through the repair work she'd been offered by 2 neighboring farms, through the careful management of every cost between now and then. She had enough, not comfortably, not without anxiety, but enough. Will found her standing there and looked at her face and read the result from it, the way he read most things directly, without needing to be told. Close, he said. Close enough. He nodded. Something in him relaxed, she saw it, the slight change in the set of his shoulders. The steer, she asked, sold this morning. Good price? Decent, good. She looked at him. I'll pay you back in the spring. Once the winter's through, and I know what the herd looks like. You don't owe. I'll pay you back in the spring, she said again. Steadily, not as a negotiation, as a fact. He looked at her for a moment. All right, they started back the same day. The ride home was longer feeling, in the way that rides home always are. The urgency of going outpaces the ease of returning. And without the forward momentum of a task ahead, the miles revealed themselves honestly. Cal, in front of them by 20 yards, had apparently decided that his social obligations for the trip were complete, and communicated only through the angle of his hat. They were perhaps an hour from the ranch, when Will said, with no particular preamble, "My father wants to meet with you." Properly, at the house, she glanced at him. He met with me at my fence line. That was him coming to look at you. This is different. What's this? Will was quiet for a beat. He wants to talk about the ranch. About the land management going into winter. He has ideas about the feed rotation that he thinks might help your remaining herd make it through in better condition. And he wants to tell me himself. He says telling Will something that Will tells you is the same as playing a game of telephone with good information. She smiled at that. He's not wrong. He's often not wrong, Will said, with the particular tone of a man who has found this quality both valuable and inconvenient over a lifetime. She arrived home to find a note wedged in her front gate. She recognized the handwriting before she'd unfolded it. Gerald Oates, his careful cursive. The handwriting of a man who had once been a good lawyer and had let himself become something slightly less. The note asked her to come to his office at her earliest convenience to discuss a revised offer from Thomas Reed. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her coat pocket with the cattle money. She went inside, started the fire, put the coffee on, and sat at Harold's table with Fraser's legal documentation, and went through the foreclosure timeline, step by step, for the 4th time, making sure she understood every protection she had. She did understand them. She'd understood them since Billings. She just needed to see them laid out again. needed the clarity of the paper in front of her. Then she took out a clean sheet and wrote a letter to Gerald Oates. She was direct. She thanked him for his service. She informed him she had retained Fraser and Billings as her primary counsel going forward, that Fraser would be in contact regarding the formal transfer of her legal file, and that she wished him well. She did not mention the December payment. She did not mention the Helena market. She gave him nothing that could make its way to Thomas Reed. She sealed it, addressed it, and set it by the door to mail in the morning. Then she went back to the ledger and started working on the $40 gap. Because it was there, and it needed solving, and sitting with unsolved things was something she had stopped being able to do somewhere between the mud in the south paddock and the morning they'd brought the roan back from the edge. She was still working when the knock came. It was later than Will usually came, later than most people came. She opened the door. Henry Dawson stood on her porch. Not Will, Henry. In his coat, hat in hand, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and has arrived to execute it. "Mr. Dawson," she said, surprised. "I told Will I'd come Tuesday," he said. "I decided not to wait until Tuesday." He held up a hand before she could speak. 5 minutes. "I won't take more than 5 minutes of your time." She opened the door wider. He came in, looked at the table with the ledger and the papers, and sat down in the chair across from hers without being invited, not rudely, but with the assumption of a man who understood that she was a person who didn't waste time on ceremony. "The gap," he said. She looked at him. $40, he said. "Give or take." She went very still. "How do you know that number?" "Will told me the Helena result. I know the December payment from what you told Gerald in August, which you told Gerald before you knew Gerald talks." He looked at her directly. "Don't be angry. I'm not here to tell you I know. I'm here to solve it." "Mr. Dawson." "Henry." She kept her voice even. I'm not offering money," he said. "I have 12 head of cattle that need wintering. My barn is full. I need a property with pasture space and a barn that has extra capacity." He looked at her steadily. "You have extra capacity. I'd like to lease it from you for the winter months." "Standard rate," she stared at him. "Standard rate for 12 head, winter months, comes to about $45, he said. "Maybe 50 if the winter's hard." He stood, put his hat back on. "It solves my problem. It solves yours. You're not taking charity. You're providing a service." He moved toward the door. "I'll bring them over Friday, if that suits." He was at the door before she found her voice. "Henry," he stopped. "Is there actually a barn capacity problem, or is this?" "There's a barn capacity problem," he said. He paused. His back was still to her. "There's also the other thing. But I'm old enough to know that a person keep their dignity better when the practical solution and the generous one are the same solution." He opened the door. "Friday, if that suits." He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she sat back down at the table. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the $40 gap. She looked at the letter to Gerald by the door. She put her head down on her arms, just for a moment, not in defeat, but in the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and has suddenly been told they don't have to hold quite as much of it alone. She sat up. She picked up her pen. She wrote "Gavard" across the $40 gap in large, clear letters. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the fields, through the repaired fence posts, around the barn, whose east wall now stood solid against it. The cattle were settled. The roan was in the small paddock, closest to the house, which was where she'd been since the night they'd walked her back from the edge. The December payment was covered. She had $400 barely. With help she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse, because refusing it would have been pride wearing the mask of independence. And she had too much respect for Henry Dawson to insult the distinction he'd so carefully drawn. What she had not counted on, what she had built no plan for, was what happened 2 days later. She was repairing the north gate latch when Will arrived, which was not unusual. He arrived most mornings now, without announcement, with work to do either his own or shared, and the line between the two had stopped being something either of them remarked on. She heard his horse at the road and kept working, because the latch was almost done, and finishing it felt more important than looking up. Evelyn, she looked up at the tone. He was still on his horse. He had a piece of paper in his hand folded, official-looking, the specific size and weight of legal correspondence. "Reed filed early," he said. Her hand stopped moving. He found a provision in the original mortgage that allows the bank to demand full payment rather than incremental if the bank can demonstrate that the property's value has declined significantly since the note written. He held out the paper. "He's commissioned a formal appraisal, his own appraiser, from Billings. Not the county assessor, someone he's brought in. The appraisal is scheduled for next week." She came to the fence and took the paper. "Read it." It was exactly as he'd said. A formal notice of appraisal, with the provision Reed was invoking cited in full. If the appraisal determined that the property's value had declined sufficiently, the bank had the right to call the entire note, not the December partial payment, but the whole $2,200. Immediately, she looked up from the paper. "Can he do this?" she said. "Fraser needs to see it today. I've already sent a wire." "Can he do this?" she said again, not panicking, asking. She needed to know. Will met her eyes. The provision is real. Whether it applies in your case is a legal question. But yes, he can try. She looked at the paper again. Reed had not come at her with his own offer again. He had not sent another friend to talk at market organizers. He had looked at the situation and identified the most efficient way to end it, and he had moved. "He knows I made the Helena money," she said. "He knows. He knows Henry's cattle are wintering here. He knows. He's doing this because he realized I'm going to make the December payment." She looked at Will, steadily. "He's changing the game because I was about to win by his rules." Will held her gaze. Yes, she folded the paper, put it in her coat. "How long do I have before the appraisal?" 7 days. "And if the appraisal comes back below the threshold?" "Fraser needs to tell you what the threshold is. But if it comes back significantly below, you'd have 30 days to produce the full amount or surrender the property." $2,200 in 30 days. She did not have $2,200. She would not have $2,200 in 30 days by any calculation that started from where she currently was. She looked at the gate, at the latch she'd been repairing, at the field beyond it, at the grass that had come back from nothing, at the fence line that had held through the early frost, at the barn whose wall stood solid, at everything she had built from a list of what needed doing, and the stubborn refusal to let hard things stay hard. She breathed it in. "Get Fraser on the wire," she said. "Tell him I need to know exactly which provision Reed is invoking, and whether it was properly included in the original mortgage instrument, because Harold bought this property in 1879, and that provision language looks newer than that." Will looked at her. "I was a secretary for a commercial firm for 6 years, she said. "I read contracts for a living. That clause was written after the original note. The question is whether it was properly incorporated, and if it wasn't, Reed's filing is defective." She looked at him. "Get Fraser." Will looked at her for one long still moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name, but felt the way you feel a shift in temperature before you can explain why. "When Fraser wires back," he said, "I want to be here." "I know," she said. She went back to the gate latch and finished the repair with her hands steady, and her mind already 3 steps ahead, because the filing was either defective or it wasn't, and if it was defective, Reed had made a mistake. And if Reed had made a mistake, she was going to find it, and she was going to use it. And Thomas Reed was about to discover the specific consequence of underestimating a woman who had spent 6 years reading contracts that men assumed she wasn't paying attention to. The latch closed cleanly. She tested it twice. It held. Fraser's wire came back in 4 hours. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the original mortgage document spread flat in front of her when Will brought it in from the telegraph office. He had ridden to town and back without telling her he was going, and she didn't ask why. She knew why. He needed to be doing something while she worked, and the wire was something he could do. She read it without speaking, then she read it again. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she did when she needed to arrange facts in their correct order before she let herself feel anything about them. "Well," Will said. "Fraser says the provision is real," she said. "It was incorporated into the mortgage in 1881 through an addendum, 2 years after Harold originally signed the note." "Is that unusual?" "It's not unusual. It happens when a bank wants to update terms on an existing loan." She paused. "But an addendum has to be signed by both parties to be legally binding. Harold had to agree to it for it to apply." Will went very still. "Did he?" She turned the mortgage document around so he could see the page she was looking at. "This is the addendum. It has the bank's signature. It has a notary stamp. It has a date." She pointed to the bottom of the page. "What it does not have is Harold's signature." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. "Reed's provision," she said, "was never agreed to by Harold. Which means it was never properly incorporated. Which means—" "He can't invoke it," Will said. "Fraser says it's not airtight." Reed will argue the provision was accepted implicitly through continued payment under the modified terms. But implicit acceptance of a provision in a mortgage instrument is a very difficult legal argument to make when the provision was never signed. She looked at him steadily. "Fraser says we fight this. He says if Reed pushes it to a judge, the unsigned addendum is enough to get the provision thrown out." Will sat down, slowly, like a man who has been braced for impact and is now recalibrating. "We need to file immediately," she said. "Today. Fraser needs to submit a formal objection to the appraisal notice, citing the defective incorporation of the provision. It doesn't stop Reed permanently, but it stops the 7-day clock while the legal question is resolved." "How long does that buy you?" "Fraser thinks 6 to 8 weeks, minimum. Long enough to make the December payment under the original terms. Long enough to establish a track record of payment that makes Reed's case for property value decline much harder to sustain. He'll fight it, of course he'll fight it. He has money, and he has time, and he has a lawyer who's better paid than Fraser." She met Will's eyes. "But he doesn't have Harold's signature. And you cannot manufacture what isn't there." Will was quiet for a moment. "Then you found this. You found it because you read the document yourself." "I read documents for 6 years while men assumed. I wasn't paying attention," she said. "It turns out that's a useful skill." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the controlled assessment, not the careful neutrality, not even the warmth she'd started to recognize underneath both of those. This was something more unguarded. Something that looked, if she had to name it, like a man encountering proof of something he'd begun to believe but hadn't let himself fully accept. "Send the wire to Fraser," she said. "Tell him to file today." "Already going," he said, standing. "I'll ride back to the telegraph." He was at the door before she said "Will." He stopped. "Thank you for getting the wire." She paused, because what she wanted to say was for all of it, for 4 months of all of it, but that felt like more than the moment could hold. For riding back to the telegraph without being asked. He looked at her for one quiet second. "I'll be back within the hour," he said, and left. She sat alone at the table with Harold's mortgage document and the unsigned addendum, and let herself feel for exactly 60 seconds what it meant. Relief, yes, but more than that, something that felt like her father's hand on her shoulder, like the click of a lock finding its key, like Harold's voice from the letter under the kitchen floor. "You've never run from hard things." He had not signed that addendum. She didn't know if it was intentional. Harold, the careful accountant, who had read every document twice, who had taught her that a signature meant you agreed, that agreeing to something you hadn't read was the only financial mistake that couldn't be undone. She would never know if he'd refused it deliberately or simply never received it for signature, and the bank had filed it anyway, hoping no one would look closely. But he hadn't signed it. and she had looked. She put the document carefully back in the box, locked it, and went out to check on Henry's cattle. Reed's response came 3 days later. Not a wire, not a lawyer's letter. Reed himself, at her front gate, this time without the assessor and without the gentle voice. He had dropped the pretense of the generous neighbor, and what was underneath it was colder and more direct, which she actually preferred. She knew how to deal with direct. "Your lawyer filed an objection," he said. "My lawyer filed a correct and legally supported objection," she said. "How is your morning, Mr. Reed?" His jaw tightened. "This is going to become expensive for you, Miss Carter." Legal processes frequently are. Fraser's is a competent man, but he's not equipped to run a protracted legal fight against the bank's resources. "That may be true," she said, "but a protracted fight requires the bank to have a defensible legal position, and your position is built on an addendum that wasn't signed by the borrower." She kept her voice conversational. "I think you knew that. I think you filed the appraisal notice knowing the provision was defective, betting that I wouldn't find it in time or wouldn't understand what I'd found." The silence that followed told her she was right. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. This was a different conversation from the ones they'd been having. This was the conversation underneath all the others. The one she'd known they'd eventually have to have. "I want to run my ranch," she said. "I want to make my debt payments on the original terms. I want to not have a bank officer sending rumors to cattle markets or commissioning defective legal filings." She paused. "I want to be left alone to do the work. And if the original payment terms aren't met, then we have a legal conversation under the actual terms of the actual mortgage document, with both parties represented, in front of a judge who has read the full file including the unsigned addendum." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want, Mr. Reed?" He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him calculating the way men like Reed always calculated, the way she'd learned to recognize from 6 years of watching commercial negotiations in a Boston office. He was measuring the cost of continuing against the cost of standing down, and what she saw in his face told her the numbers were not going in his favor. "The December payment," he said finally, "on time. Full amount, $400 against the principal, as agreed with Fraser. And the monthly interest payments. Not deferred. I've never deferred them," she said. "You know that." He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his reins. "December, Miss Carter," he said, and rode away. She went inside and sat down at the table, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of a confrontation that has gone the way it needed to go. The shaking that comes after the fact when the body finally acknowledges what it just went through. She pressed her hands flat on the table until they stopped. Will arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at her face and knew. He backed down, he said. For now, he'll watch. He'll wait for a payment to be late or a term to slip. But for now, yes. Will pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was new. He had sat at her table before, over ledgers and legal documents, and the practical business of keeping the ranch alive, but this felt different. This felt like a man sitting down because he wanted to be in the room, not because the room contained a problem to solve. You negotiated with Thomas Reed at your own front gate and won, he said. I had the document. Other people had access to that document. Nobody else read it the way you did. She looked at him. Say what you're saying, Will. He held her gaze. You saved this ranch. Not yet, you're going to. It was not a prediction offered gently as encouragement. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who had been watching closely enough to be certain. December is 6 weeks away. You have the cattle money. Henry's wintering fee covers the gap. The legal provision is neutralized. You're going to make the payment, and Reed knows it, which is why he stood down. He paused. You saved this ranch. She was quiet for a moment. My father believed I could, she said. Your father was right. You didn't think so. When I arrived, he looked at her without flinching from it. No, I didn't. What changed? He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it, rather than offering the easy answer, the flattering version. You were in the mud that first week, he said, trying to move the cattle. And you were losing, and you looked at me when I rode up, and you said you knew you looked ridiculous. And then you asked what you were doing wrong. He paused. Most people in that position would have tried to explain why it wasn't their fault. Or they would have already given up. You did neither. You just asked what you were doing wrong. I needed to know. I know, that's why I answered. He looked at the table. I'd spent 3 years answering the same way for Pete Sully, who nodded and didn't change. The difference isn't intelligence. It's whether you actually want to know, or whether you want to look like you want to know. He met her eyes. You wanted to know. She sat with that for a moment. And now, he held her gaze for a long, quiet second. Now I think about things differently than I did in September. That was a sentence with a great deal inside it, and she recognized it as such. And she did not push on the edges of it, because she had learned his rhythm well enough to know that pushing was exactly the wrong response. She received it the way the roan had finally learned to receive her, not flinching away, but not rushing toward either. Just present. Henry's cattle, she said after a moment. How is he, really? Will's expression shifted, less guarded now about this topic than he might have been 2 months ago, the controlled neutrality giving way to something more honest. Slower than he admits. He came over this morning to check on the wintering operation, and he was moving carefully. He doesn't want me to notice. He's letting me notice, she said. He talks to me more than you might expect. Will looked at her. What does he say? That you work harder than anyone he knows. That you've been carrying the property alone for 3 years, and the carrying has cost you things you don't talk about. She paused. He doesn't say it like that. He says it sideways. But that's what he means. Will was quiet. He also says you're stubborn in ways that have served you, and stubborn in ways that haven't, she said. And that the difference between the two kinds is whether the stubbornness is protecting something real or protecting something that already ended. He looked at his hands on the table. He talks about Catherine, she said, very carefully. I know he does, not to me, just around the edges of things. Enough that I understand. What do you understand? She considered her words, that you loved her very much. That losing her made the world smaller for a long time. That small felt safer. She met his eyes when he looked up. And that smaller and safer are not the same thing, even when they feel like they should be. The kitchen was very quiet. The wind moved outside. Henry's cattle were doing whatever cattle do in the cold, settling into the rhythm of a winter they did not need to understand, only survive. Will did not look away from her. Catherine died in November, he said. 4 years ago. Riding accident, her horse went down on the East Road in the first ice of the season. I was 100 yards behind her, and I couldn't. He stopped. Steadied. I couldn't get to her in time. She held very still. After that, I thought the thing to do was make everything smaller. The property, the conversations, the number of people who could. He stopped again. The number of people who could matter, she said softly. Yes, she did not fill the silence that followed. She let it be what it was, not empty, but full of what it needed to be full of. He had given her something that had been locked for 4 years, and the correct response was not words. After a moment, he said, I should have gone first that morning. It was icy. I always went first on ice. Will, her voice was firm, gentle but firm. You cannot carry that and also be here. And you are here. She held his gaze. You have been here every morning for 4 months. That is not the behavior of a man who is not present in his own life anymore. He looked at her for a long time. You have a way, he said, of saying things simply that are not simple things. I was a secretary. I wrote letters for men who didn't know how to say what they meant. You learned the direct version. The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she'd seen from him that wasn't prompted by something outside himself. She stood and poured coffee, because the moment needed somewhere to go, and coffee was practical, and practical was safe ground for both of them. She set his cup in front of him and stood at the stove with hers. The December payment, she said, returning to solid ground. I need to make it in person, at the bank, with Fraser's documentation of the original terms and the objection filing on record. I'll go with you. You don't have to. I'll go with you, he said again. The same way he'd said her name in Billings, simply. Finally, she nodded. All right. The following weeks had the particular quality of time that is running out but not yet gone. Every day felt both urgent and full in a way she hadn't experienced before. Henry's cattle settled into the wintering paddock, with the ease of animals in good condition under decent management. And Henry himself came over 3 times a week to check on them, and stayed progressively longer each visit, sitting at her kitchen table and talking about land management and weather patterns, and eventually other things. It was Henry who told her about the town's opinion of her, which had been shifting the way ice shifts in spring. Not dramatically, all at once, but incrementally, with the grinding persistence of something with real weight behind it. Abbott told 3 people about the Helena negotiation, Henry said. Creel told 2 more. Word gets around that the Carter woman held her price with both of them and didn't blink. That's the kind of thing that gets remembered out here. He looked at her over his coffee. The town was waiting to see if you'd last the first hard frost. Then they were waiting to see if you'd break under Reed. Neither thing happened. What are they waiting for now? Henry smiled. It was a smile she'd learned to read warm underneath its weathered surface, carrying something affectionate in a way he would never express directly. For whatever comes next, he said. They've given up predicting. The blizzard that came in late November did not announce itself politely. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of wind that had changed in character, not the ordinary winter wind she'd grown accustomed to, but something different, lower and more sustained and carrying actual force. She lay still for a moment, listening, identifying it. Then she got up. She was dressed and pulling on her coat when she heard it, not hoofbeats, not the gate, but a knock at the door. Hard and fast, the knock of someone who'd ridden hard to get there. She opened the door. Will stood on her porch with snow in his coat, and the specific look of a man who had ridden over in the middle of a forming blizzard, because the alternative was waiting. And waiting was not something he did when there was something to be done. The south pasture fence, he said. The section we reinforced in October, the new post, is the problem. The ground froze around it. Wrong, it's shifting. She was already reaching for her gloves. The cattle, still in, but if that post goes, the whole south section opens. They'll scatter. How long do we have? If the wind holds at this level, an hour, maybe less. She pulled on her second glove. Let's go. He looked at her. She saw in his face the same conflict she'd seen in his face, the day of the storm on the Helena Road. The day she'd fallen off the horse, the reflexive, protective impulse meeting the knowledge of who she had become. The two things working against each other, in the space behind his eyes. Evelyn, I know the fence, she said. I've worked every section of it. You need me out there. She met his eyes. Let's go. They went. The wind was extraordinary, the kind that doesn't push so much as press, leaning its full weight against every surface it encounters. She kept close to Will, close enough to stay oriented, the lantern in her hand, doing its best, against the dark and the driving snow. She knew the path to the south pasture fence, without needing to see it, which was useful, because seeing was largely unavailable. They reached the compromised post in 11 minutes. She felt the problem before she saw it. The fence had a different give to it, a looseness in the tension that told her immediately what Will had described was correct. The post had shifted 6 inches out of its frozen ground socket, and the wire attached to it had gone from taut to dangerous. Loose enough that the cattle could push against it without the fence pushing back. I need the come-along, she said. He had it. Of course he had it. They worked in the blizzard, with the focused efficiency of 2 people who knew exactly what needed to be done, and had spent 4 months learning to work alongside each other without wasted motion. She held the wire tension while he repositioned the post, her shoulders burning with the effort. The cold trying to take her hands away from her, and failing, because she did not let it. He drove the post deeper and reset the anchor, the physical effort brutal in the wind, and she watched his hands and responded, without being told, adjusting tension. When he called for it, releasing when he said release, moving when he said move. The fence held. They stood back and looked at it together, breathing hard. "It'll need a proper repair in the morning," he said. "I know. This holds it through the night." They checked the rest of the south line, half a mile, in the blizzard, with the lantern, moving methodically because the methodical way was the only way that worked. It took 40 minutes. 2 more sections had minor stress points they flagged for morning. Nothing critical. When they reached the gate and came through it, she realized she couldn't feel 2 of her fingers on her left hand. She pulled the glove off and looked at them white, which was not good. Will took her hand before she'd processed that he was going to. He held both of her frozen fingers between his palms and pressed them. Steady pressure, steady warmth, and she stood there in the wind and the dark and let him. "They'll come back," he said. "Move them." She moved them. Pain arrived, which meant feeling was returning, which was the right kind of pain. "I should have worn the heavier gloves," she said. "Yes. You're not going to say I told you so. Did I tell you to wear the heavier gloves?" "No, then I have nothing to say so about." She looked down at her hand, still held between his. His hands were warm, even now, even after 40 minutes in the blizzard, the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in weather, and whose body had made its accommodations. He didn't let go. She looked up. In the lantern light, in the snow, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not guarded, not measured, not careful. Open, in the way of a door that has been closed for a very long time, and has finally decided that what it was protecting no longer needs to be protected, at the cost of keeping everything else out too. "There's something I should have said," he said. "Will. Let me say it." He held her gaze. "I told you in September that I wasn't going to run your ranch. That I'd show you how. That was true, and I meant it." His hands tightened slightly around hers. "What I didn't say, because I didn't know it yet, was that somewhere between the south fence and the cattle in the mud and the ride to Billings and the night with the roan, I stopped showing up because your ranch needed me." She was very still. "I started showing up," he said, "because I needed to." The wind moved around them. The lantern swayed. The cattle in the south pasture were settled behind their repaired fence, warm and unaware, doing what cattle do. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to know it too." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The way he looked at problems he was trying to understand from the inside out. Then William Dawson, the man who spent words like a man with a limited supply, did something she had not expected. He laughed, not long, not elaborate, just a real sound, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he deeply respects and finds the experience both humbling and entirely right. "You were waiting," he said. "You were worth waiting for." He lifted her recovered hand and held it for a moment, not the practical grip of warmth transfer, just held it. "The way you hold something you're deciding is yours." "The December payment," she said after a moment, because the December payment was still real, and Thomas Reed was still out there, and the ranch was still not safe, and she was still the person who kept track of that. 3 weeks, he said. "Are you still coming with me to the bank?" "Did you think I wasn't?" She almost smiled. "I thought I'd confirm." He let go of her hand, not reluctantly, in the way of someone who lets go of a thing because they're not worried about losing it. "Go inside," he said. "Get warm. I'll check the north fence before I head back." "You don't have to." "I know," he said, like he always said it. Because knowing he didn't have to was exactly the point. She went inside. She pulled off her coat and her boots and sat at Harold's table and pressed her left hand between her palms until the last of the cold was gone. She looked at the ledger and the legal documents and the locked box with Harold's letter and the mortgage that had his signature in all the right places and the wrong ones in none. She thought about a man laughing in a blizzard. She thought about 4 months of hard things that had not stayed hard. She thought about what it meant that he had started showing up because he needed to, and she had been in the south paddock, or the north field, or on the roof of the barn every time he arrived, already working, already in it, already proving not to him, but to the land, and to Harold and to herself, that she was the person she had decided to be. The day she read 3 sentences in a white envelope and sat down on the floor of her hallway, and then eventually got back up. The fire in the stove crackled and held. Outside, the blizzard pressed on. Inside, Evelyn Carter opened the ledger and made a note in the margin next to December's entry, 4 words, in small, precise handwriting. "We will be ready." 3 weeks after the blizzard, Evelyn Carter walked into the First Territorial Bank of Dawson Creek at 9 o'clock in the morning, with $412 in a leather envelope, Fraser's legal documentation in a separate folder, and William Dawson 1 step behind her. She had counted the money 4 times. Not because she doubted the number, she had not doubted the number, since Henry's wintering fee came in and she'd written those 4 words in the margin of the ledger, but because counting, it was the thing she did with her hands when her mind needed to stay calm, and she needed her mind calm today. Thomas Reed was already there. She had expected that. A man like Reed did not let a payment arrive without witnessing it personally, partly to confirm it was real, and partly because watching someone succeed on terms he'd tried to prevent was the kind of thing that required a man of his temperament to see with his own eyes, so he could properly recalibrate his next move. She had thought about that on the ride into town. She had thought about every angle of what was about to happen in this building, the same way she'd thought about every angle of the fence repair, in the blizzard, methodically, completely, without leaving herself any gaps to fall through. Reed looked at her. He looked at Will. He looked at the leather envelope. She laid the envelope on the clerk's counter without speaking to Reed. She handed over Fraser's documentation. She stated her name and the property address and the payment amount with the flat precision of someone who has rehearsed the words until they are simply words, carrying nothing extra. The clerk counted the money, stamped the receipt, entered the payment in the ledger. She took the receipt, looked at it once, put it in her coat pocket. Then she turned to Thomas Reed. "Mr. Reed," she said, "the payment is on record. The December term is satisfied. Fraser's office has a copy of all documentation, and the objection to your addendum filing remains active in the county record." She paused. "I trust we're done with the creative interpretations of mortgage language." He held her gaze. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, the same calculation she'd seen in the yard, at the gate, at every point of contact they'd had since the beginning. The calculation of a man who has been patient, because patience has historically served him, and as confronting evidence that this particular situation is not going to yield the way situations usually yield. "The original terms run 18 more months," he said. "I'm aware, 18 months is a long time, a lot can happen." "Yes," she said, "it can." She kept her voice even. "A great deal has happened in the last 4 months alone. I find I've developed a tolerance for a lot happening." Something shifted in his face. Not concession. Reed was not a man who conceded, but a recognition. The recognition of a man who has met an obstacle he has correctly classified as permanent and is adjusting his map accordingly. He nodded once, turned left. She stood at the counter and breathed. Will put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a moment. Just contact, the way you touch something to confirm it's solid, and then took it away. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. They rode back in the mid-morning light, and the world looked different from horseback, with $412 delivered and receipted and standing in the county record. The fields on either side of the road were white and still, the kind of still that comes after a storm has passed, and the land has absorbed what it needed to absorb and is simply resting now. She had spent months learning to read this land, its moods and its silences, and the specific way it communicated distress versus stability, and what she read in it this morning was neither drama nor celebration. Just continuity, just the ongoing fact of a thing that intends to remain. She had come to love that quality. The land's indifference to whether any individual drama resolved itself. It would be here either way. The question was only whether she would be here with it. She was going to be here. She had made that decision in a Boston hallway, with a white envelope in her hand, and she had remade it every morning since, and she was making it now, on this road, in this light, with the receipted payment in her coat pocket, and the roan waiting at home, and 18 months of mortgage terms ahead of her that she intended to satisfy one by one. Henry Dawson was at her kitchen table when they got back. This was not unusual anymore. Henry had developed the habit of arriving when he felt like it, and departing when he was finished, in the manner of a man who had decided that the formalities of visiting were an inefficiency he was no longer young enough to observe. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and the ledger open, not reading it intrusively, just looking at the most recent entries in the way of someone who tracks things by reflex. He looked up when they came in. "Well," he said. "Done," Evelyn said. Henry nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank from it, and said nothing for a moment, and she understood that the nothing was his version of the kind of emotion that other people expressed loudly. He had told her once, sitting in this kitchen on a cold afternoon, that Harold Carter had been one of the only men he'd known who understood that restraint was not coldness, that some people felt things so fully they had to hold very still to contain it. She thought about that now, watching Henry hold very still over his coffee cup. "Read," Henry said. "He'll be careful for a while," Will said, sitting down across from his father. "After that we'll see. He won't quit," Henry said. "No," Evelyn agreed, taking her coat off and hanging it on the peg. "But quitting isn't the only thing that matters. Losing momentum matters too. He spent 4 months trying 4 different approaches, and none of them worked. That costs something, even for a man like Reed." Henry looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of approval level, direct, carrying more warmth underneath it than the surface suggested. "Harold told me once," he said, "that the only thing he regretted about leaving Montana was that he'd never know if he could have made it work." He paused. "He knows now." She sat down at the table. The 3 of them sat together in the kitchen of the farmhouse that had been dying when she arrived, and was not dying anymore, and the fire in the stove held, and outside the December cold pressed against the windows and did not get in. The weeks between the December payment and Christmas had a different quality from everything thing that had come before. The acute urgency, the immediate threat, the 7-day clocks, and the defective provisions, and the cattle market, and all of it had not disappeared entirely, but it had stepped back. What replaced it was not ease exactly, because the ranch was still the ranch, and work was still work, and 18 months of payments were still ahead of her. But it was something that felt, for the first time, like ground she could stand on without bracing. She used the time well. She always used time. Well, it was one of the things she'd brought with her from Boston that translated directly. The efficiency of someone who had spent years managing other people's schedules and had internalized the value of an hour. She worked the remaining herd through the winter feeding rotation Henry had designed for her, a more sophisticated system than the one she'd started with, calibrated to the specific animals she had and the specific demands of a Montana December. She completed 2 repair jobs for neighboring farms that she'd agreed to in November fence work, both of them which she was by now competent to do quickly and correctly. She met twice with Fraser, going over the remaining mortgage timeline in detail, building a payment schedule that anticipated every variation she could think of. And she started writing down what she knew. It began as notes for herself, observations about the cattle, about the feed rotation, about what had worked and what hadn't across the past 4 months. She wrote them at Harold's table in the evenings, in the clear, precise handwriting she'd developed over 6 years of commercial correspondence, and she wrote them with the same methodical completeness she brought to everything. She was not sure why she was writing them down. She only knew that she was building something, and that building it required documentation, because documentation was how you turned experience into something that could survive beyond the moment. Will saw the notes one evening and picked them up without asking. The way he picked up things that were left in plain sight and clearly not private, one of his habits she had stopped finding surprising. He read for a moment, looked up. "You're writing a management record," he said. "I'm writing what I've learned," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "A management record is for running the ranch. This is for understanding it." She paused. "I arrived here not knowing anything. Everything I know now, I learned in 4 months. If something happened to me tomorrow, if I broke an arm, or got sick, or had to leave, for some reason this ranch would lose everything I've learned with me. That seems like a bad system." He set the notes down. "Nothing's going to happen to you tomorrow. Something is always potentially going to happen to someone tomorrow," she said. "That's not morbid. That's a reason to write things down." He looked at her for a moment. "You think about everything." "I think about what needs thinking about. Most people," he said carefully, "when they've just survived 4 months of the kind of thing you've survived, take some time before plan for the next problem. The next problem doesn't wait for me to take time." "Evelyn," he said, her name, with the particular weight he'd been putting into it since Billings, since the night he'd said it the first time, and they'd both heard what it meant when he said it. "The payment is made. The provision is neutralized. The cattle are in good condition. Reed has backed off." He held her gaze. "You can breathe." She looked at him. The thing was, she was breathing. She had been breathing, but she had also been in motion so continuously for so long that stillness felt like a foreign language. She understood it, conceptually, but couldn't quite speak it yet. She was aware of this about herself. She had been aware of it since the first week, when she'd realized that the relentlessness she'd always thought of as discipline was also, sometimes, the thing she hid inside when she was afraid. "I don't know what to do with quiet," she said. It came out more honest than she'd intended. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer, like he recognized it. "Neither did I," he said, after Catherine. "I made the world smaller instead. Kept moving inside the smaller world so I didn't have to feel how small it was." She looked at him. "I'm not doing that anymore," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I know you're not." "I want to be clear," he said again. "Because I want you to understand that I'm not saying the quiet is dangerous. I'm saying you're allowed to be in it. You've earned it." He paused. "And I'd like to be in it with you, if that's something you'd want." She looked at him, across the table, in Harold's kitchen, in the ranch she had rebuilt, from the list of what needed doing, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unsettled since supper. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming shut on the bad things. Just settling. The way a well-made fence settles after the ground has accepted the posts. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'd want." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same hand he had held in the blizzard. He held it for a moment. Then he turned it over, and she felt his thumb trace across her palm, just once, the most careful and deliberate gesture from the most careful and deliberate man she had ever known. And she understood what it meant coming from him, that it was not casual, that nothing he did was casual, that this was a man who did not offer things he did not mean. She turned her hand over and held his. The fire held. The wind was outside. The notes sat on the table between them, pages of what she'd learned, and they sat there together. In the quiet they had both been afraid of, and were both now choosing instead. Christmas came to Dawson Creek that year. In the specific way, it came to small western towns not with fanfare, but with the particular warmth of people who had made it through another hard season and understood, without needing to say it, what surviving together meant. There was a gathering at the church on Christmas Eve that she went to, with Henry on one side and Will on the other. And the town that had watched her arrive in October, expecting her to leave by winter, had to make a different kind of accounting of who she was. She did not mind being looked at. She had stopped minding it some weeks ago, when she'd realized that the town's attention had changed. Character had shifted from the speculative, watching of people expecting failure to something. More like the attention given to someone who has become part of the landscape. Not famous, not celebrated, just present in the way that things that belong somewhere are present. Taken into account. Abbott was there, and he shook her hand and said the cattle had been excellent, and he'd want first consideration next fall. Creel was there, and said nothing to her directly, but nodded with the grudging respect of a man adjusting a previous assessment. Eli from the livery asked how the gelding was doing, and she told him honestly, and they talked about horses for 5 minutes in the easy way of people who share a language. Henry, sitting beside her on the church bench, leaned over at one point and said quietly, "Harold would have liked tonight." She held that for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he would have." "He'd have liked you," Henry added. "The you that came out here. Not the Boston version, you're still you, but Montana made something else available." He looked at her sideways. "Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," she said. He nodded, looked forward. After a moment, very quietly, so that only she could hear, it made the same thing available for Will. "Watching you," he paused. "In case you were wondering." She did not look at Will, who was on her other side. But she felt him very specifically beside her. "I wasn't wondering," she said. Henry made his adjacent to a law sound. "No, I didn't think you were." January came in with a cold that was different from anything she had experienced in the previous months, not the dramatic violence of the November blizzard, but a deep, settled cold that was simply the temperature of the world now, taken for granted by every living thing that had learned to accommodate it. The cattle accommodated it. She accommodated it. She had bought the heavier gloves Will had not quite told her to buy, and her coat was better lined than the one she'd arrived in, and she had learned how to move through this kind of cold, without fighting it, leaning into it instead, letting her body understand it rather than resist it. She was in the barn doing the morning feeding, when Cal appeared at the barn door. This was unusual. Cal came to her property occasionally, when Will sent him with equipment or a message, but Cal did not come alone without a reason, and the look on his face told her immediately there was a reason. "It's Henry," he said. She put down the feed pail. Henry had collapsed in his kitchen that morning. Not dramatically, not the kind of collapse that announces itself as the worst thing. More like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and sat down more heavily than he intended, and then discovered he couldn't get back up with the same ease. Will had found him. The doctor from town had been sent for. She arrived at the Dawson property 20 minutes after Cal did, moving fast across the frozen ground between their properties, on the path she had worn between them over 4 months. Will was in the kitchen, standing at the window with his back to the room, and the doctor, a compact man named Ellery, who smelled of pine and had the brisk manner of someone who delivered news regularly, was coming out of the bedroom. Will turned when she came in. She went to him, not carefully. Not with the measured approach she'd learned to use with him, the approach that respected his pace and his rhythm and his need to come to things in his own time. She went to him directly, because this was not a situation that called for careful, and she put her hand on his arm. And he looked at her, and she could see in his face what 4 months of learning his expressions had taught her, to read the controlled surface, holding something underneath it that was not controlled at all. "He's stable," she said to Ellery. "Stable," Ellery confirmed. "Heart, I think. Needs rest. Needs monitoring. Needs," he paused, looking at Will. "Someone checking in regularly." "That's settled," she said. Ellery looked at her, looked at Will, made the calculation of a man who sees things clearly, and decided he didn't need to ask who she was to make that statement. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, and left. She and Will stood in Henry's kitchen. "He'll be angry about this," Will said. His voice was steady. It cost him something to keep it steady. "He'll be angry, and he'll be fine," she said. "He's Henry. He doesn't know how to be anything other than fine. He's 65, and his heart gave him a warning this morning." "I know." She kept her hand on his arm, "and we'll take care of him. Both of us." He looked at her. "You've got your own." Will, she said it the way he said her name simply. Finally. We've been doing this together for 4 months. That doesn't stop, because the problem is on your side of the fence line. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him processing it, not the logic, because the logic was clear, but the meaning, underneath the logic, the implication of together said in that tone, with that certainty, in this kitchen. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. Henry was awake and irritable by mid-afternoon, which was the most reassuring possible sign. He objected to the bed rest. He asked 3 times about the wintering cattle. He told Will that he was fine, and Will should stop looking at him like that. He told Evelyn, when Will stepped out to attend to the horses, that he had told Will 6 months ago to stop being alone, and he was glad someone had listened. I didn't do it on instructions, she said. No, Henry said. That's why it worked. He looked at her from the pillow, with the steady, direct gaze that she had come to understand was his most honest mode. He's going to ask you something. When the time is right, and he's decided the time is right, which will be when he's sure, and Will is never sure until he's completely sure. He paused. Don't make him wait too long. Henry, I'm an old man who had a heart episode this morning, he said. I get to say what I want. She bit back something that was almost a smile. He hasn't asked me anything, he's going to. Henry settled back against the pillow. He was half in love with you by October. He was mostly in love with you by the time you went to Helena. He was completely done by the blizzard. He closed his eyes. He just needed to be sure the ranch was going to be all right before he said it, because he didn't want you to have to think about 2 things at once. She sat with that for a moment. That's very like him, she said softly. Yes, Henry said, it is. He was asleep 2 minutes later. She sat beside him until Will came back, and when Will came back and looked at his father sleeping, and some of the tightness went out of his face, she thought about what Henry had said and understood it completely, because she knew this man. Had spent 4 months learning this man, and the information was entirely consistent with everything she knew. He had been waiting until she was safe. Of course he had. February arrived. Henry recovered, with the stubborn efficiency of a man who has decided that recovery is work, and work is what he does. He was on his feet within the week, slow and careful at first, then progressively less slow, then simply careful, which Ellery said was the correct pace, and Henry said was an indignity he intended to endure briefly. The January scare had changed one thing. Will began spending more time at the Dawson property, more time with Henry, and Evelyn came with him in the evenings when her own work was done. And the 3 of them developed a rhythm that was easy in the way of things that have been built from actual material, rather than expectation. Henry talked. Will was present in his quiet way. She sat at the table and contributed when she had something to contribute, and was comfortable in the silence when she didn't, because she had learned that silence in this company was not empty. The roan had a calf in February. She had not known. The roan was pregnant, had not caught it in her assessments, because she was still learning, and pregnancy in early stages required an experienced eye she didn't quite have yet. Will had suspected it since December, and had said nothing because he wasn't certain, and because he thought watching her discover it herself would be better than telling her. She found out on a Tuesday morning when she went to the small paddock and found 2 animals where there had been 1. She stood at the fence for a long time. The calf was small and wet and entirely determined to exist, working its legs with the single-minded focus of something that has arrived in the world and intends to stay. The roan stood over it with the specific stillness of a mother who has just done the hardest thing and is now doing the next thing, which is simply being present. She heard Will at the gate behind her. You knew, she said. I thought. You didn't tell me. I wanted you to find it. She looked at the calf, at the roan standing over it, at the evidence of something that had been growing inside, what she'd thought she understood, completely invisible, until it wasn't. She trusted me enough to do this here, she said. In this paddock, yes. She turned to look at him. He was leaning on the gate with the ease of a man who is exactly where he wants to be, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen in the blizzard open, unguarded, the door that had decided it did not need to stay closed. "Henry told me you were going to ask me something," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Henry talks too much." "Henry nearly had a heart attack. He's entitled to talk too much." Will looked at her. The morning light was doing what morning light did in February, thin and clear, honest without being harsh. She could see him clearly. She had always been able to see him clearly, from the moment he'd stopped on his horse at the fence line in October and said, "You're the Carter girl." And she'd corrected him, and something had shifted in his face. "The ranch is stable," he said. "Yes, the December payment is made. The legal provision is neutralized. The herd is in good condition." He paused. "You're going to be all right. I know. I needed to know it first. I needed." He stopped. "I needed it to be true before I said anything, because I didn't want you to have to hold two things at once when one of them was still in question." Henry said, "That's what you were doing." "Henry should have been a telegraph operator," Will said, with the particular exasperation of a man who loves someone very much and finds their timing both accurate and inconvenient. She waited. He came through the gate. He stood in front of her, with the morning light on his face and his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. Will always had his hat. The hat being in his hands was the physical expression of something deliberate, something that had been thought about and decided on. "I have been alone for 4 years," he said. "I made it into a decision because it's easier to live inside a decision than inside a loss. And then you arrived, and you went into the mud, and you asked what you were doing wrong, and you went to Billings, and you read the mortgage document, and you went out in the blizzard, and you never not once asked me to be something different from what I was." He held her gaze. "You just stood beside me and waited for me to figure out what I already was." She felt something move through her chest. "Evelyn Carter," he said, "I would like you to stay. Not for the ranch. Not because Harold left it to you and you've earned it. Because I would like you to stay." She looked at him for a moment. "Will Dawson," she said. "I was never leaving." He looked at her. "I decided that in October," she said. "In the mud, actually. When you came to the fence and showed me how to move the cattle, and then said, 'Most things need to see the path before they take it.' I decided then," she paused. "The ranch gave me a reason to stay. You gave me a reason to want to." He put his hat back on, reached out and took her hand, the same hand he had held in the blizzard, the hand whose fingers he had warmed between his palms in the wind and the dark. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Behind them the roan's calf was on its feet. Unsteady, new, entirely committed to the task of being upright in the world. The roan stood beside it and let it find its balance, patient in the way of things that understand balance takes time, and presence is the only thing that helps. The spring came, the way spring comes to Montana, not gently, but with a kind of insistent, pragmatic warmth that says, "Enough of that, now this." The ground softened. The fields, which she had watched and worried over all winter, began showing the first green that meant the land's accounting had come out on the right side of the ledger. The herd moved into the outer pastures for the first time in months, and the cattle spread across the available ground with the specific satisfaction of animals restored to their proper scale. She walked the south fence on the first genuinely warm morning of March, checking the line the way she had walked it every week since October, with the same piece of paper and the same pencil she'd had the day Will first appeared on his horse, and said she'd need more than that. The fence was solid. She had built it solid, post by post and wire by wire, learning every section of it the way you learn something you intend to keep. Will fell into step beside her at the corner post. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared, because that was how he moved through the world, and always would be. The specific quiet that had stopped startling her and had become, instead, one of the sounds of this place. Like the cattle in the morning, and the wind, through the repaired barn, and the roan's calf, which had been named by Evelyn, and objected to by Will, and accepted by Will within 48 hours, because the calf's name was Harold, and some arguments were not worth having. South line is good, she said. I see that. East corner post is going to need attention before summer. The ground movement in the thaw. I'll bring the driver Saturday. She made a note on the paper. He watched her write it the same way he had watched her on the first morning, but not with the same assessment. With something that had no assessment in it at all. Just attention. Just the specific attention of a man who finds the person he is looking at genuinely interesting and has long since stopped trying to pretend otherwise. Fraser sent a letter, she said. The spring payment schedule is confirmed. If the herd performance holds through summer, the fall market should cover the next 2 principal payments. It'll hold, I think so too. She folded the paper. Reed commissioned a new assessment of the Whitmore property last week. Cal heard it in town. He's moving his attention. He's moving his attention, she confirmed. Which means we're no longer interesting to him. Will was quiet for a moment. How does that feel? She thought about it. Like a door closing from the outside, she said. Like whatever was coming through that door has stopped coming. The room is quieter. Good quiet or bad quiet? She looked at him. Good quiet, she said. The kind I'm learning to be in. He put his arm around her, briefly, in the easy way of someone who has decided that ease is not something to be rationed. She leaned into it for a moment, the warmth of him, against the March morning. And they stood at the corner of the south fence, on a piece of land that had been dying, and was not dying, anymore. Henry came out of the farmhouse behind them. He'd been inside with his coffee, and the ledger, which he continued to examine, with the proprietary attention of a man who had decided that investment justified oversight, and he looked at the two of them at the fence line and made his adjacent to a law sound and went back inside without comment. The calf, Harold, was in the near paddock, doing what calves do in March, testing the boundaries of the available world, pressing against fences, not to escape but simply to understand where things ended. The roan watched from a few feet away, present and unhurried, the way she watched everything now. Evelyn watched the calf for a moment. She thought about the letter. Under the kitchen floor, in the locked box, Harold's handwriting, "You've never run from hard things. You find a way through." She thought about a rainy Tuesday in Boston and 3 sentences that had sat down on the floor of her hallway and then gotten back up. She thought about mud and cattle and a mortgage document and an unsigned addendum and a blizzard and a man who had put his hat in his hands and said, "I would like you to stay." She thought about what it meant to build something from the ground up, with your own hands, on land that started as debt and silence and a dying dream and became this specific, imperfect, entirely real thing. She thought about her father keeping a photograph on his desk for 23 years. A photograph of a porch and fields and mountains. A photograph of something he had loved and left, and paid taxes on every year from a distance, because he could not bear to let it go entirely. She thought about what it had cost him to carry that, and what it had cost him not to come back, and she thought, "I came back for you, Harold. I came back to the place you couldn't, and I stayed, and I built it, and it is alive." Will's hand found hers at her side. She held it. The land spread out around them in every direction, her land. Hers because she had stayed, when everyone expected her to leave. Hers because she had asked what she was doing wrong, and listened to the answer. Hers because she had read a document carefully and found the line that wasn't signed. Hers because she had gone out as a blizzard and fixed the fence and held the wire while someone she trusted drove the post. Hers because some things are not inherited but earned, one hard morning at a time, one repaired fence and one recovered calf, and one honest conversation at a time, until the accumulated weight of all the small things becomes the only proof that matters. She had come to Montana with 2 trunks and a letter of authorization, and no idea what she was doing. She was still here, the ranch was still here, and the silent cowboy next door, the man who had spent 4 years making the world smaller and had decided, one mud-covered Tuesday morning at a fence line, to let it be large again, was standing beside her in the March light with his hand in hers. And that was not a small thing. That was in fact everything. Dawson Creek Farm did not become the biggest ranch in Montana. It did not make Evelyn Carter famous or wealthy in the way that stories sometimes promise at their endings. What it became was something more durable than either of those things: a working ranch, run by a woman who had learned every inch of it with her own hands, with a healthy herd and solid fences, and a payment schedule that stayed current, and a first-year calf named Harold, who grew to be the strongest animal in the paddock. And at the kitchen table, where the ledger lived, in the evenings when the work was done, two people sat together. In the quiet they had both been afraid of and had both chosen, and the fire held, and the land rested. And the story of the woman who had inherited a dying farm, and the silent cowboy next door, settled into the permanent record of a place that knew, now, what it meant to be saved, not by a miracle, but by something far more reliable. By two people who refused to give up, by showing up and staying and doing the work. Every single day, Viet Lai Fun Hook Modo của kịch bản này cực mạnh. Modo bằng một hành động cảm xúc hook cực mạnh, bộc lộ ngay hành động cảm xúc định ngay lập tức tiết lộ xung đột với tiêu đề, Cones and Dot, không giới thiệu. Xi 90-110 to sign it. Thomas Reed slid the paper across the table. Or lose everything by Friday. Evelyn Carter looked at the pen. Looked at the deed to her father's ranch, the land he had loved silently, for 23 years, paid taxes on from a distance, and left to her with a letter that said, "You find a way through." She pushed the paper back. No, Reed's eyes went cold. "You have no cattle experience. No money. No one in this county believes you'll last the winter." She stood up. "Then they'll be watching closely," she said, "when I prove them wrong." She walked out and never looked back. If these stories speak to your heart, subscribe to our channel and never miss one, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels.